The sparring between the United States and China has taken a new twist, with student visas now in the firing line. Beijing has accused Washington of racial discrimination after the visas of Chinese students and researchers were revoked.
China has lashed out at the U.S. for revoking the visas of more than 1,000 of its citizens. It has blasted the move as political persecution and threatened to retaliate.
美国政府公然采取损害中国在美留学人员合法权益的措施，是赤裸裸的政治迫害和种族歧视，严重侵犯了中国留学人员的人权。 美方应该立即停止利用各种借口对在美中国留学生的无端限制和打压。
Nearly 370,000 students from mainland China study in the United States. They bring in significant revenue to American colleges. U.S. officials say those who had their visas canceled were deemed to be security risks. They say legitimate students and scholars will continue to be welcomed.
We are blocking visas for certain Chinese graduate students and researchers with ties to China's military fusion strategy to prevent them from stealing and otherwise appropriating sensitive research.
This spat is the latest blow to U.S.-China relations. Ties between the two powers have plummeted in recent months, with clashes over COVID-19, trade, and Hong Kong.
And senior editor Jeremy Coe joins us now for more. Jeremy, so the tit-for-tat continues. How do you expect Beijing to respond to this latest move now?
Well, we certainly expect China's move to come swiftly, possibly over the next few days. Now, I just heard this afternoon China's foreign ministry spokesperson said that China reserves the right to make a further response on this issue. But how exactly could China retaliate? Now, observers suggest that further educational restrictions, including imposing its own education visa bans on Americans, could take place. Now, after all, we've seen both sides already engaged in various rounds of retaliatory actions over issues like trade, technology, as well as media access over the last few months. And in July, U.S. consulate in Chengdu closed just days after the U.S. closed the Chinese consulate in Houston. But this time round, even if China were to impose its education visa bans on Americans, the impact might not be the same as the U.S. doing so. Now, Chinese students form the single largest foreign student population in the U.S. There are over 370,000 of them in the U.S. Now, in contrast, just over 12,000 American students are in China. So because there's such a large number of Chinese students in America, we also expect that American universities will push back against the Trump administration's move. But no matter what, the latest move will add to the uncertainty that Chinese students will face about studying or even working in America. And some Asian American activists have warned that Trump's orders will create a climate of suspicion on campuses, with students of Asian descent, especially the Chinese, facing questions about their intentions. And this climate of suspicion will likely persist even if Trump is not re-elected in November.
Jeremy, there have been high and low points between these two countries, particularly during Trump's presidency over the last 3.5 years. But relations between these sides, they've sunk to their lowest level, arguably, in decades. So how did we get here?
Now, if you recall, Mr. Trump bashed China in 2016 during his presidential campaign then. He complained that China had taken advantage of lax trade policies from past U.S. administrations of both political parties. But then after taking office, Trump then courted Mr. Presidency of China, even going so far as to call him a friend. But then, of course, all these changed again when Mr. Trump shifted his tone later during his first term. He criticized Beijing on a range of issues, including accusing Beijing of trying to improperly influence U.S. elections. But still, Trump generally refrained from criticizing Mr. Xi directly, even at the height of the trade war. But of course, all these changed since earlier this year during the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Trump referred to this as the Wuhan virus, the China virus, and he even called Mr. Xi an enemy. Now, the pandemic has also certainly pushed Mr. Trump, the Trump administration's China hawks to the fore. Now, among them, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, as well as White House Trade Advisor Peter Navarro. Now, they see the pandemic as a historic opening to rebalance decades of U.S.-China relations, and they're pushing for a U.S.-China commercial split right now.
All right, saying all that, because, the U.S. election is coming up in November, can we expect relations between the U.S. and China to then further deteriorate?
Now, by all indications, it's likely to get worse, maybe much worse before it gets better. Now, even though foreign policy doesn't usually loom large in US presidential elections, Trump has tried to make China the issue in the upcoming polls in November. And he's also sought to portray his challenger, Democrat Joe Biden, as incapable of standing up to leaders in Beijing. So now it's really shaping up into a race on who's tougher on China, Trump or Biden. And Mr. Biden has also toughened his stance against China as November approaches. He's vowed, among other things, to stand up to Beijing, and he's also accused Mr. Trump of getting played by Chinese leaders, which means there's no signs of any let-up in China-US tensions anytime soon. But it's still unclear how heated things may get between now and November. Now, there are a great number of issues between both sides that could blow up between now and then. Among other things, the sale of F-16 military jets to Taiwan, Mr. Trump ordering Chinese order of TikTok to sell its US assets over alleged national security dangers, and in general, just the US upping pressure on Chinese tech firms, including cutting off Huawei from its key semiconductor supplies, and also charging former intelligence officers with providing classified documents to Beijing. Now, China, of course, has refuted most of these allegations and is also accused the US of bullying. So while a US-China decoupling would be unthinkable just a few years ago, now it appears that the decoupling of the world's two largest economies might have just begun. Now, even if Mr. Biden wins, some observers say his hands may be tied. Now, the current political environment in the US, both on the left and the right, will require Mr. Biden to continue being tough on China, even if he wins November's vote. And if Mr. Trump wins, it could lead to a much more fundamental long-term shift in China policy, and that's one that could last generations. So in short, no short-term reprieve in sight for US-China relations and tensions as well.
Thank you very much there. Jeremy Coe speaking to us.